Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian. I'm here today at the James Julia Auction House. I'm taking a look at some of the machine guns that they're selling in their October of 2015 auction. And one that I noticed that they had was this guy, which is kind of the unappreciated red-headed stepchild of US World War II automatic weapons. This is a Reising model M55 submachine gun. It's chambered for 45 ACP, and these were actually adopted in fairly large numbers by the US Marine Corps. Now, the Reising has gotten itself a pretty bad reputation. They were, in fact, pretty much discontinued. They went out of service in the Marine Corps as soon as other guns, other options came along. But at the beginning of the war, this was what the Marine Corps had for submachine guns. Now, the reason for this is that historically the Marine Corps has always played second fiddle to the Army in terms of equipment. So, for example, the Army got M1 Garand semi-automatic rifles first. The Marine Corps got them when the Army was done getting equipped. So the Marine Corps actually went into several island campaigns in World War II using bolt-action Springfield rifles. Well, the same thing applied to submachine guns. The supply of Thompson guns was pretty darn limited. A lot of them were going to the United Kingdom. They were being bought by Britain. A lot of them were being bought by the Army, and they were expensive and time-consuming guns to make, and there wasn't any left for the Marine Corps. So when they started looking around, the gun that they were able to find was this submachine gun designed by a guy named Eugene Reising. He was actually a pretty accomplished gun designer. He was born in 1884, and by World War II, he had worked for a whole bunch of different major gun companies in the US. He had actually worked under John Browning. His patent ideas, he had over 60 firearms patents by the time of his death. And some of his ideas were involved, for example, in the iteration and the development of the 1911 pistol. So he was a qualified guy. He had designed this submachine gun, and it had a number of advantages over the Thompson. Primarily, it was a heck of a lot lighter. This is something like 6.5 pounds, where the Thompson is not quite double that, but close. The Reising fired from a closed bolt, which meant it was potentially a lot more accurate on the first shot. You didn't have that mass of the bolt flying forward to disrupt your aim after you pulled the trigger, but before the bullet actually fired. So the Reising would go on after World War II to actually be a pretty popular and pretty effective and well-regarded police submachine gun. In police hands, it was excellent. It was a closed bolt gun, it was nice and accurate, and the problems that it had during World War II didn't really affect it in the civilian police role. So, speaking of which, the problems that it did have were the finish on them wasn't very good. They tended to rust very, very quickly in the Pacific. You'll see veterans' accounts of the guns rusting overnight, no matter what they tried to do to prevent it. They were a somewhat complex, overly complicated mechanism. They are actually a delayed blowback gun, despite being a 45 ACP submachine gun. That's the delayed blowback mechanism is what allows them to be a lot lighter than some of their competitors. But it did have the downside of being potentially fouled up by dirt and, say, volcanic sand on Iwo Jima. One of the other problems was these guns were, one of the good things about them was they were in production right now. We can buy them and they'll be here. And we need submachine guns like right now. So that's a definite plus for the Reising is we can get them. Well, part of being able to get them was that the production line hadn't been refined to make every part interchangeable. There was still some hand fitting in these guns, or at least trial and error fitting. And what they discovered was, yeah, that made for really good availability. Right now we can get the guns, but if you disassembled them in the field and tried swapping parts between different guns, it might or might not work. Some units of the Marines had a standard policy of the whole squad would clean their guns together, and you'd disassemble them and everyone would throw all the bits in buckets of cleanser together, and then when you went to reassemble the gun, you'd pull out a bolt and pull out a spring and all the different parts. That worked fine on M1 Garands, which were completely interchangeable. That didn't work on Reisings, and they didn't realize that before they started trying it. So incidents like that lead to a lot of dissatisfaction with the guns among soldiers who need them to work right now. So this particular version is the M55, which has this incredibly cheap, and it's not quite flimsy, sort of, but it's like the crudest folding stock ever on a submachine gun. They also had the Model 50, which was basically the same gun. It had a half-inch longer barrel and usually had a compensator, and it had a full stock on it, a full fixed wooden stock without a pistol grip. The M50 here, or 55 here, was specifically for paratroopers and for tank crewmen. It was initially obtained in part for the Paramarines. The Marine Corps set up a paratroop unit. They didn't end up actually jumping anywhere, but for those guys, they needed rifles, they needed firearms that were compact and you could easily jump out of an airplane with. And that led to the M55 Reising being adopted. It also led to the 1941 Johnson rifle being adopted because you could pull the barrel out of a Johnson very easily, and then you had two nice compact pieces. At any rate, in total, between 1942 and 43, about 80,000 of these guns were contracted for by the U.S. Marine Corps and received, and a pretty even split between 50s with the full stock and 55s with this folding stock. They were initially, sent to specific units, but there seems to have been a lot of swapping back and forth amongst Marines in the field, and you'll often find them in the hands of guys who probably wouldn't have had them issued in the first place. They were apparently quite popular with tankers. The alternative at the time was a Thompson, and a Thompson is a lot bigger and bulkier in the confines of a tank than these guys are. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at how this disassembles and a few of its foibles, and then why don't we take it out in the field and actually try doing some shooting with it. Before we do a disassembly, let's start with a couple basic controls, because there are only a few. We have our selector lever right here on the side of the gun. All the way forward is FA, full auto. Then I can pull it back to semi-auto and back all the way to safe. One of the Marine Corps complaints was that you cannot tell in the dark just by feel what selector setting you're on. And that's legit. Now, all right, the magazine release right here. We're going to take this lever, push it up, and then you can pull out the magazine. The magazine catch is a peg that goes into that round hole right there. Now, this is a 20-round magazine. Later in the war, they did have some issues with these. You'll see, by the way, they are marked H&R Reising. These guns were all made by Harrington and Richardson. This is a double stack, single feed magazine, meaning that it goes from two stacks of cartridges and then it has to compress down into a single stack here. That's often causes issues. It makes it a little easier to design the gun because you only have a single position where the bolt has to be able to feed around instead of alternating left and right. But it makes the magazine a little more finicky to feed. The magazine feed lips also weren't as strong as they probably should have been. Again, this is an issue of a civilian gun that really just wasn't adequately hardened for military usage. So you will also find magazines that look like this, but they have a pair of deep ribs on each side. Those are actually single stack magazines. Those ribs force only a single column of cartridges, and they only hold 12 rounds. So they adopted some of those as well. Obviously 12 rounds in a submachine gun isn't really a very good solution, but standard mags like this were 20. All right, looking at the front end of the gun, you may notice there's no bolt handle sticking out anywhere. That is because the charging handle is actually on the what's called the action bar, which is here inside the fore end of the stock. We grab that, pull it back, that opens the bolt. So there is the plus side to that is that there's no bolt handle on the outside reciprocating. The downside is this does reciprocate, so you don't want to stick your finger in there when you're shooting. There's also no hold open, automatic or manual, so it's a little tricky to do basic things like swabbing the barrel because you have to hold this thing open the whole time. And it's easy for that to be kind of obscured under the sling and a little tricky to get to, especially if you're wearing the sling and it gets tied up in some position. And, again, this will be a recurring theme you'll see. Civilian, fine. Military use, maybe not so much. Lastly, we have our shoulder stock, which is just a bent chunk of wire that is held in place by tension on this little metal tab and held open by tension on these two little metal tabs. So it opens to there, and I snap it in place, and presto, a stock. Not the most comfortable stock ever, possibly the least comfortable stock ever, but it works. And if you're jumping out of an airplane, sometimes it's more important that the gun be easy enough to carry that you'll actually have it with you. All right, let's take this apart, shall we? We're going to start by loosening up that screw. That screw is captive in the stock, so it won't actually come out, but it's what locks the barreled action and all the mechanical bits into the stock. So we'll loosen that up. There we go. This pin was not supposed to fall out. We'll get to that little guy in a minute. Now we will begin to see why the Marine Corps really didn't like this gun. Disassembly, you get this theme again. Not bad for a civilian gun where you don't have to do this all that often and you can do it in your living room and it doesn't matter really how finicky it is. Not a good thing for a military gun. So the first thing I'm going to do is take this screw plug out the back. The outside of this is knurled. I'm using a screwdriver because it's easier. There are a couple of spring-loaded detents to hold this in place so that it won't actually come out unintentionally. That's a good thing. So, all right. This is our hammer spring and guide rod. The hammer does not look like a normal hammer. That is the hammer. We'll get to this in a minute. Now, the next thing I need to do are take out these two pins. They are tapered. You saw the one fell out because I didn't have it in tight enough to begin with. You are supposed to use the gun's hammer to tap these out if they're too tight. I'm going to use a little gunsmithing hammer instead. I'll go out on a limb here and say that a military weapon should not require hammers and punches to field strip in the field. That's just me. So we now have these two pins. They are tapered top to bottom here. They are also curved to put tension on the magazine well to hold it in place. Now we need to take the magazine well off, which we do by taking the action bar off. But before we can take the action bar off, we have to have it back here, and we need to hold it in place, but there's no catch. So, and I swear to you, this is what the manual says to do. We pull it back until we can see the little disassembly hole. We then take the hammer spring, and you insert the end of the hammer spring, let's go with this end, into that hole right there, and then let the spring come forward on it. So our hammer spring end is actually what's holding the action bar and the main spring compressed. Now that we've got that, in order to take the action bar off, and it will pop the magazine well out with it, we have to hold these up with one hand, and then the action bar lifts up and forward, and all this stuff kind of wiggles off. There we go. What could go wrong, right? No problem doing this in a volcanic foxhole on Iwo Jima, right? Piece of cake. Now, last step, now that the action bar is off, I can pull the trigger and the bolt comes out the back. Okay, now that we have this thing apart, we can see how it actually functions because it is a delayed blowback system. There are also a couple of little clever bits that I do want to show you. For example, we have this bar in the magazine well. That bar actually hits this extended rib on the back of the magazine, and that's what sets the magazine insertion depth. So you can see the bar there. Once I've got the magazine as far up as it's supposed to go for proper feeding, there is no way you're over inserting that magazine. So, well done. Good thing. All right, now our bolt and action bar. So this would be sitting in this position. It has this hook on the back that fits into that recess on the bolt. Goes back and forth like this. At the forwardmost travel, the bolt face hits the chamber, the action bar keeps going forward, and it pushes the back of the bolt up. There is a recess in the receiver, which is a little bit hard to see, but it's right, you can see the line where it goes from dark to shiny. That is the recess where the bolt locks in. When we dry cycle this, when it's complete, you can watch how the bolt tips. It tips up into the back of the receiver there. Now, the back end of that recess is not square, it's tapered, and the back of the bolt is also tapered. So the delaying action comes from simply the friction of these two inclined surfaces. The bolt has to push itself back down like that before it can travel. And that's enough to allow a gun in .45 auto to function safely with this really fairly light bolt and not an overly stiff recoil spring. So in that way, again, good design. This allows you to have a full auto .45 caliber subgun that only weighs like 6.5 pounds. That's a good thing. Now, I mentioned we would get to this hammer, which does not look like a hammer you're probably used to seeing. And in fact, when you think about it, there's a hole right in the middle that matches this firing pin on the bolt. How does that work? It's actually exactly the right diameter so that when they're lined up, this hammer can't do anything. Well, think about the fact that the bolt tips up in the receiver. Once it tips up, now this, which you could call a hammer, you could also call a striker, sort of. Now that hits the firing pin. This is actually a safety so that the gun cannot fire unless the bolt is up in its recess. Because if it's straight in line, hammer goes forward, misses the firing pin completely. It's only when the gun is up there that it can actually detonate a cartridge. Pretty clever. Eugene Reising wasn't stupid. This gun isn't stupid. This gun just isn't adequately hardened for military use in military conditions. This is why it made such a great police gun after the war. So that is pretty much all of our functional detail there. I'm going to go ahead and reassemble this, and then I think it's time we took it out on the range for some shooting. All right, guys, so we're going to put a few rounds through this guy. I've got a 20-round mag loaded. I am going to shoot right-handed today because of the stock on this thing. Let's go ahead and see how it is. One thing that I read was that these were advertised as being a very slow rate of fire because that's what the government wanted, but that they were actually more like about 800 rounds a minute, which is pretty darn fast for a .45. So we will find out. Do the first couple rounds in semi. It's an extremely light shooting gun in semi-auto. Let's try it in full. That's neat. That's actually, I was expecting a reasonably heavy kick because it is such a light gun, but you really don't get it even with this absolutely horrendous wire stock. It's not bad at all. Doesn't climb all that badly, although it does climb some. It's definitely not as controllable as the equivalent 9mm gun, but I can see why Marine Raiders would have really liked these as long as they run reliably. It's very handy to carry with this stock folded. This thing is super compact. It's nice to carry. It's, you know, the thing is you will find battlefield pictures of Marines using these guns even after things like M1 carbines and grease guns were available. So not everybody hated them. Let's do some more shooting. These are really slick, actually. I think I would want one, if I had the choice, and if I wasn't going to carry it all day, I can see why people would want the fixed stock. But man, when you fold that thing, this is just super compact and short compared to anything else that was available at the beginning of World War II. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. You don't often see M55 Reisings, although the Reising is actually one of the more common and more affordable guns on the NFA market in the US. If you're looking for a machine gun you know, these aren't nearly as expensive as you might expect for a genuine Marine Corps issue World War II submachine gun. So it can be a really cool starter machine gun for someone who's looking to get into it. And there's a lot of neat history behind these, despite their bad reputation, which is partly deserved and partly not. If you're interested in this one, check out the link in the description text below. That'll take you to the Julia auction catalog page about it. You can see their pictures and their description, and between that and what you've seen here today, if you think you need to have it, well, you can place a bid online or you can come up here to Maine and participate in the auction live. Thanks for watching.